somewhere along the moss-draped bayous of southern Louisiana, in the brutal summer of 1872, 11 men died in their beds. Not from yellow fever, not from consumption. Each one had his throat opened with surgical precision while he slept. Their bodies discovered at dawn with expressions frozen between ecstasy and terror. All 11 were prominent members of the Knights of the White Camellia, the region's most feared chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. Local authorities documented the deaths as unrelated incidents spread across 4 parishes, filing reports that contradicted witness statements and physical evidence. The case was quietly closed within 6 months, all records sealed by order of the parish judge. But in the cramped quarters of the colored sections, in the back rooms of freedmen's churches, another story circulated, one that would be whispered for generations, never written down, never spoken aloud where white ears might hear. Tonight, that story can finally be told. Before we continue with the story of the woman they called La Veuve Noire, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this one, stories that were deliberately buried, that powerful men wanted forgotten, these are what we uncover on this channel. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Are you hearing this from Louisiana, from the Deep South? I want to know where our community is watching these forgotten histories come to light. The story begins not in 1872, but 4 years earlier, in the ashes of a war that had supposedly ended. St. Martin Parish in 1868 was a wound that refused to heal. The grand plantations that had once produced sugar and cotton by the ton now stood like rotting teeth against the Louisiana sky. Their fields returning to swamp, their manor houses occupied by federal troops or left to collapse under the weight of their own former glory. The town of Breaux Bridge served as the parish seat, a collection of weather-beaten buildings clustered around a courthouse that had changed flags 3 times in 7 years. The population had shifted in ways that terrified the old planter class. Nearly 4,000 former slaves now walked freely through streets where they'd once been forbidden even to make eye contact with white residents. They owned property, some of them. They voted, protected by the presence of Union soldiers and the Freedmen's Bureau. They testified in courts of law against white defendants. An inversion of the natural order so profound that many longtime residents spoke of it as a kind of apocalypse, the end of civilization itself. In response, the Knights of the White Camellia had emerged from the remnants of Confederate veteran societies and local militias. Unlike their more famous counterparts in other states, the Louisiana Knights prided themselves on a certain sophistication. They wore no hoods, burned no crosses. They were lawyers, merchants, former officers, plantation owners trying to salvage what remained of their holdings. They controlled the local courts, the sheriff's office, the parish council. They didn't need theatrics. They had power. Their tactics were surgical. A freedman who spoke too boldly in town might find his crops burned, his mule hamstrung, his credit at the general store suddenly revoked. A colored man who registered to vote might be visited at night by well-dressed gentlemen who explained quite reasonably why he should reconsider. Violence was saved for those who proved intractable, and even then it was calculated, designed to send a message without attracting federal intervention. The Knights met every Thursday evening in a back room of the Breaux Bridge Hotel, a 3-story establishment on Main Street owned by Harold Jessup, one of their founding members. 11 men comprised the inner circle, the decision-makers who determined which freedmen needed to be reminded of their place, which white Republicans needed to be encouraged to leave the parish, which federal sympathizers required more aggressive persuasion. Into this powder keg walked a woman who called herself Celeste Dufresne. She appeared in Breaux Bridge on a Tuesday morning in late April, stepping off the steamboat from New Orleans with a single trunk and a parasol of black silk. She was perhaps 30 years old, though her face held a quality that made age difficult to determine. Not young, not old, but somehow outside the normal progression of years. Her skin was the color of café au lait, that ambiguous shade that in Louisiana could mean anything from Creole aristocracy to mixed parentage of a dozen different origins. She wore mourning clothes of expensive cut, the kind of garments that required a skilled seamstress and fine fabric, suggesting means and status. She took a room at the Bro Bridge Hotel, paying a month in advance with gold coins that she counted out one by one onto Harold Jessup's front desk. Her French was flawless, her English spoken with a Parisian accent that fascinated the locals. She claimed to be the widow of a French merchant who had died in New Orleans during the yellow fever outbreak of the previous summer. She was, she said, looking to purchase property in the parish, perhaps a small house with land where she might live quietly, away from the disease and chaos of the city. The story was plausible enough. New Orleans had indeed suffered a devastating epidemic. French merchants did business throughout Louisiana. Well-bred Creole widows often sought refuge in smaller communities. And there was something about Celeste Dufresne that discouraged close questioning. A dignity, a self-possession that suggested she was accustomed to being treated with respect. She attended Mass at St. Bernard Catholic Church every Sunday morning, sitting in the section reserved for Creole families of standing. She took her meals in the hotel dining room, always alone, reading French novels or writing letters in a neat, precise hand. She walked through town in the afternoons, parasol shading her face, nodding politely to those she passed but initiating no conversations. She seemed to have no interest in the racial tensions that consumed the parish, no political opinions, no connections to either the freedmen's community or the federal authorities. Within 2 weeks, she had caught the attention of every man on the Knights Council. It started innocently enough. Thomas Broussard, who owned 1,500 acres of struggling cotton fields east of town, encountered her outside the general store on a Wednesday afternoon. She was examining a bolt of fabric, her gloved hands moving over the material with a practiced touch. He offered his assistance. He knew the merchant, he said, could ensure she received a fair price. She smiled at him, a smile that seemed to hold both gratitude and a hint of amusement, as if she found his chivalry charming but unnecessary. They spoke for perhaps 10 minutes, during which she mentioned her difficulties in finding suitable property, her unfamiliarity with the region, her reliance on the kindness of strangers in this difficult time of mourning. Broussard found himself thinking about her for the rest of the day. There was something magnetic about her, a quality he couldn't quite name. It wasn't simply beauty, though she was undeniably attractive. It was a kind of focused attention, as if when she looked at you, you became the only person in the world who mattered. When she touched his arm lightly while thanking him for his help, he felt the contact like an electric current. He began finding reasons to be in the hotel lobby when she passed through. He offered to show her properties that might suit her needs. She accepted with a modesty that seemed to acknowledge both his generosity and her own vulnerable position as a woman alone. They rode out to several parcels over the following days, always properly chaperoned by the presence of others nearby, always concluding before sunset. Broussard told his wife these were potential business transactions, that he was helping a respectable widow as any Christian gentleman would. But he thought about Celeste constantly, the way candlelight caught the curve of her neck, the faint scent of lavender that clung to her clothes, the way her eyes met his sometimes with an expression that seemed to see through all his careful respectability to something raw and hungry beneath. The other knights noticed Broussard's distraction, and gradually several of them began their own acquaintance with Madame Dufresne. Antoine Leclerc, a lawyer who had defended several clan members in federal court, offered his legal services should she need assistance with property transfers. Dr. Raymond Hebert, who served as parish coroner, expressed concern about her health, the stress of widowhood, the changing climate, and suggested she might benefit from a consultation. Eugene Fontenot, who ran the largest dry goods store in the parish, extended a generous line of credit for any household items she might need once she found her home. Celeste accepted each offer with the same gracious reserve, never seeming to encourage attention, yet somehow making each man feel that he alone understood her situation, that he alone could provide what she needed. She was, they told themselves, a respectable woman in difficult circumstances. Their interest was purely chivalrous. The fact that she occupied their thoughts, that they invented reasons to visit the hotel, that they found themselves making comparisons between her refined manner and their wives' provincial ways. These were simply natural responses to an exceptional woman. By June, the dynamic within the night's Thursday meetings had subtly shifted. The 11 men who had always worked together with military precision now engaged in small rivalries, subtle competitions for status and standing. Broussard mentioned his afternoon drives with Madame Dufresne. Leclerc countered with his legal consultations. Hebert spoke of her delicate constitution, her need for a physician's regular attention. The others, Jessup the hotel owner, Marcus Thibodeau, who controlled the parish newspaper, Judge Vincent Theriot, who had authority over the local courts, Sheriff Claude Devereaux, banker Philippe Rousseau, plantation owners William Duplantis and Charles Arsenault, each found their own ways to establish connection with the fascinating widow. None of them noticed that Celeste had never actually purchased any property. None of them questioned why a woman supposedly fleeing New Orleans would choose Breaux Bridge, a violent backwater torn apart by racial conflict. None of them wondered why, for a grieving widow, she seemed remarkably composed, never weeping, never speaking of her lost husband except in the vaguest terms. And none of them knew that late at night, after the hotel grew quiet, Celeste Dufresne sat at the small desk in her room and added notes to a leather-bound journal, recording each man's habits, his vulnerabilities, his secrets, his sins, recording where he lived, who guarded his house, whether his wife slept soundly, whether he kept weapons near his bed, recording everything she would need to know when the time came to collect her debts. Because Celeste Dufresne, if that was even her real name, had not come to Breaux Bridge to purchase property, or to mourn a husband, or to escape yellow fever. She had come for a very specific purpose, one that required patience, planning, and a willingness to use every weapon at her disposal. She had come to kill 11 men. The first death occurred on July 19, 1872, during the worst heat wave anyone in St. Martin Parish could remember. Thomas Broussard's body was discovered by his wife at dawn. He lay in their bed in the plantation house he'd inherited from his father, his throat opened from ear to ear with such force that the cut had nearly reached his spine. The sheets beneath him were soaked through with blood, as was the mattress, as was the floor beside the bed. The violence of the wound contrasted sharply with the peacefulness of his face. His eyes were closed, his features relaxed, his hands resting at his sides as if he'd simply drifted off to sleep and never awakened. Mrs. Broussard's screams brought the household staff running. Among them was an elderly colored woman named Esther, who had served the family since before the war, first as a slave, now as a paid servant. Years later, in testimony that would never make it into official records, Esther would describe what she saw when she entered that bedroom. Not just the body, not just the blood, but something else that made no sense, and that she immediately understood she should never speak of to white authorities. There were 2 wine glasses on the bedside table, both empty. The room smelled of lavender and something else, something sweet and organic that Esther couldn't identify. Mr. Broussard wore only his nightshirt, which was rucked up around his thighs. The bedclothes were disturbed in a pattern that suggested vigorous activity before death. And though Mrs. Broussard had been sleeping in an adjacent bedroom, she suffered from insomnia and often took separate quarters to avoid disturbing her husband. There was clear evidence that Broussard had not been alone when he died. Sheriff Devereaux arrived within the hour, along with Dr. Hebert. They examined the scene, questioned the servants, and established what would become the official narrative. Thomas Broussard had been murdered by an intruder, likely a freedman with a grudge, who had crept into the house during the night and cut his throat while he slept. The lack of signs of struggle suggested the killer had been swift and skilled. The fact that nothing had been stolen indicated this was personal, not robbery. Perhaps, the sheriff speculated, it was retaliation for one of the many reminders the Knights had delivered to uppity-colored folks in recent months. But Esther, cleaning the room after the body had been removed, found something the white men had missed or chosen to ignore. Caught in the floorboards near the bed was a single long hair, dark and lustrous, too fine to belong to Mrs. Broussard. And when she stripped the sheets, she found them stained with more than just blood. There were other fluids present, evidence of activities that respectable people didn't discuss, but that every woman recognized. She said nothing. She burned the sheets, as Mrs. Broussard instructed. She swept the floor clean, scrubbed the bloodstains, opened windows to air out the smell of death and secrets. And when the other servants asked her what she'd seen, she told them only what would keep them safe. That Mr. Broussard had been killed by an intruder, that the sheriff was investigating, that they should all be careful not to go out alone at night. But in the colored section of town, among people who had learned to see what white folks refused to acknowledge, a different story began to circulate. Whispers about the woman who had recently arrived in town, the beautiful widow who had caught the attention of so many prominent men. About Thomas Broussard's frequent visits to the hotel, the way he'd looked at Madame Dufresne, the afternoons he'd spent showing her properties that he never seemed to mention to his wife. About how convenient it was that a man known for his cruelty to freedmen, a man who had personally overseen the whipping of 3 colored men the previous month for the crime of trying to vote, had been found with his throat cut just days after he'd been seen dining privately with the mysterious Creole widow. The funeral took place on a Saturday, the entire town turning out to pay respects. The knights attended in a body, standing together near the grave, their faces grim. They were not fools, these men. They recognized that the murder of one of their own was a message, a declaration of war. They assumed it came from the freedmen's community or from federal sympathizers. They discussed in low voices how to respond, what measures to take, which colored leaders needed to be made examples of. None of them noticed that Celeste Dufresne attended the funeral as well, standing at a respectful distance, veiled in black, her head bowed in apparent prayer. None of them saw the small, satisfied smile that curved her lips when she thought no one was watching. And none of them guessed that in exactly 3 weeks, there would be another funeral. Antoine Leclerc died on August 9th, in circumstances eerily similar to Broussard's death. He was found in his bachelor quarters above his law office, throat cut, face peaceful, evidence of female company shortly before death. This time, the investigating authorities, what remained of them, given that the sheriff and coroner were themselves knights, could not maintain the fiction of a random intruder. 2 knights, dead in identical fashion within a month, suggested a pattern, a targeted campaign. The whispers in the colored community grew louder. La Veuve Noire, they called her now, the Black Widow. The woman who seduced powerful white men and left them dead in their beds. Some spoke of her with fear, worried that she would bring reprisals down on the entire freedmen's population. Others spoke with a grim satisfaction, a sense that justice, denied through official channels, was being delivered through other means. Because the thing that white authorities refused to acknowledge, the thing that every colored person in St. Martin Parish knew without needing to be told, was that Celeste Dufresne had not chosen her victims randomly. Every man she seduced, every man she killed had blood on his hands, real blood, not metaphorical, real. Each of them had personally participated in violence against freedmen and their families. Thomas Broussard had overseen multiple whippings and had burned the cabin of a freedman who'd filed a complaint with the Freedmen's Bureau. Antoine Leclerc had defended Klan members in court by intimidating colored witnesses, threatening their families, ensuring that justice was never served. The pattern would continue with each subsequent victim, though white authorities would never make these connections, would never ask why these specific men were targeted. On August 12th, the remaining 9 knights held an emergency meeting in the hotel's back room. The Thursday night gatherings were no longer sufficient. The situation demanded immediate action. They needed to identify the killer. They needed to protect themselves. They needed to restore order before panic spread through the white community. It was Judge Theriot who first voiced what several of them had been thinking, but hadn't dared to say aloud. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice heavy with reluctance, we must consider the possibility that the killer is someone we know. Someone who has access to these men's homes. Someone they trusted enough to let down their guard. The room fell silent. They all understood the implication. Broussard and Leclerc had been killed in their own beds, apparently without struggle, apparently after intimate activities. The killer had to be someone they would admit to their private quarters, someone whose presence wouldn't alarm them. A woman, Dr. Hebert said quietly. It would have to be a woman. They looked at each other with growing horror as the pieces fell into place. A beautiful woman, recently arrived in town. A woman who had, one way or another, attracted the attention of every man in the room. A woman whose background, now that they thought about it carefully, was strangely vague, supported only by her own testimony and the general plausibility of her story. Madame Dufresne, Sheriff Devereaux said. Mother of God. It's Madame Dufresne. But even as they reached this conclusion, even as they began to discuss how to investigate her, how to prove her guilt, how to arrest her without causing a scandal, they faced a terrible problem. Each of them had spent time alone with her. Each of them had, in ways they hadn't admitted even to themselves, been seduced by her. Each of them had secrets they didn't want exposed. Visits to her hotel room, gifts they'd given her, promises they'd made. To investigate her would be to investigate themselves, to invite scrutiny they couldn't afford. And beneath their fear and anger ran another current, one that none of them would acknowledge: fascination. Because even now, even knowing what she might be, what she might have done, several of them couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't stop remembering the way she'd looked at them, touched them, made them feel like men of power and importance, rather than bitter remnants of a dying world. Before we go further into this dark tale, I need you to understand something. This story gets deeper, more twisted than anything you've heard before. If you're feeling that chill down your spine, if you're asking yourself how far this went, you need to hit that like button right now. Drop a comment with your theory about what happens next. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because we're about to reveal how this game of death played out, and you won't want to miss a single detail. Let's continue. The investigation into Celeste Dufresne began with careful discretion. Judge Theriot used his authority to quietly request information from New Orleans, sending telegrams to police contacts and courthouse clerks, asking about a Creole widow named Dufresne, whose husband had supposedly died in the yellow fever outbreak. The responses when they came were troubling. No merchant named Dufresne had died in New Orleans during the epidemic. No death certificate existed for anyone matching that description. The address Celeste had provided as her New Orleans residence was a boarding house whose owner had no recollection of anyone named Dufresne. It was as if the woman had materialized from thin air, her entire past a fabrication. Sheriff Devereaux, meanwhile, began discreetly questioning hotel staff and local shopkeepers. What he learned painted a portrait of a woman who was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. She kept regular hours, attended church, purchased normal household items, but no one could say they really knew her. She had no friends, no confidants, no visitors except the various knights who had called on her. Her room was always neat, her behavior always proper, but there was something about her that people found difficult to describe. Not threatening exactly, but unsettling in a way they couldn't articulate. The colored servants at the hotel proved more informative, though only when questioned privately and with assurances of protection. A housemaid named Rachel reported that Madame Dufresne's room contained no personal effects beyond basic necessities, no photographs, no letters, no mementos of a deceased husband. Just clothes, toiletries, and a locked trunk that she never saw opened. The room always smelled of lavender, even when Madame wasn't present, as if she'd infused the very walls with her scent. More tellingly, Rachel had twice seen Madame Dufresne return to the hotel very late at night, well after midnight, entering through a side door and moving through the hallways like a shadow. On both occasions, she'd been carrying what looked like a leather medical bag, though what business a widow would have with such items, Rachel couldn't imagine. While the investigation proceeded, the Knights implemented security measures. Those with families sent them to relatives in other parishes, claiming business necessities. Those who lived alone hired guards, former Confederate soldiers who patrolled their properties at night. They varied their routines, changed their locks, kept loaded pistols within reach. They stopped going out after dark unless in groups. They treated every sound, every shadow with suspicion, and they waited for the next death, because they all understood with grim certainty that it was coming. Dr. Raymond Hebert was the third to die, found in his medical office on August 27th with his throat cut and his body arranged on his own examination table. The circumstances were nearly identical, evidence of female company, wine glasses present, that same peaceful expression contradicting the violence of his death. But this murder included a new element that sent ice through the survivor's veins. Pinned to Dr. Hebert's chest with a surgical pin was a small piece of paper. On it, written in an elegant hand, were two words: "Remember Baton Rouge." The Knights understood immediately what the message meant, though the local authorities and newspapers never would. In March of 1868, Dr. Hebert had traveled to Baton Rouge to testify in a federal inquiry into Klan violence. A colored woman named Sarah Boudreaux had accused several white men, including Knights from St. Martin Parish, of attacking her husband and burning their home. Dr. Hebert had testified that Sarah's husband had died not from injuries inflicted by the attackers, but from pre-existing health conditions, a lie that had helped the accused men go free. 3 months later, Sarah Boudreaux had been found dead in a rooming house in New Orleans, her throat cut, the crime officially attributed to robbery, though nothing had been taken. The note made clear that Celeste knew about this incident. More than that, it suggested a connection to it, a personal investment in seeing Dr. Hebert punished for his role. But how could she know? How could a Creole widow from New Orleans have such detailed knowledge of Klan activities in Baton Rouge 4 years earlier? The answer came from an unexpected source. Judge Theriot, reviewing old newspaper reports and court documents, discovered that Sarah Boudreaux had not been alone when she died. She'd had a daughter, approximately 12 years old at the time, who had disappeared after her mother's murder. No record existed of what became of the girl. She'd simply vanished into the chaos of post-war Louisiana, one more displaced child among thousands. The judge brought this information to the Knights' next meeting, held in Jessup's hotel on a Tuesday night, moved from their usual Thursday schedule in an attempt to break any predictable pattern. He laid out the timeline. Sarah Boudreaux murdered in 1868, her daughter disappeared, and now, 4 years later, a mysterious jumping at every sound. Judge Theriot moved his family out of the parish entirely and began conducting his business from Baton Rouge, returning to Breaux Bridge only for court sessions and never staying overnight. Harold Jessup closed his hotel, unable to maintain operations when no travelers would risk staying in a building where multiple murders had originated. Sheriff Devereaux was the only one who maintained his routine, though he now traveled with 4 armed deputies at all times and slept in the parish jail rather than his own home. As the nominal head of law enforcement, he felt obligated to maintain some semblance of order, even as he privately acknowledged that he was powerless to stop the killings. It was Devereaux who noticed the pattern that everyone else had missed. He'd been reviewing the dates of the murders, marking them on a calendar, when he realized they weren't random. Each death had occurred exactly 2 weeks after the previous one, a rigid schedule that suggested planning and control rather than opportunistic killing. If the pattern held, the next death would occur on October 29th. He brought this observation to what remained of the Knights' leadership, just himself, Jessup, Thibodeau, and Judge Theriot. They met in the jail, in a cell with bars on the windows and guards at the door, the only place they felt marginally safe. "She's playing with us," Jessup said, his voice rough from whiskey and sleepless nights. "She wants us to know when it's coming. She's trying to drive us mad with waiting." "Then we use it," Devereaux replied. "We know the date. We prepare." All four of us stay together in a secure location with armed guards. We make ourselves impossible targets. We break the pattern. They agreed on a plan. On October 28th, they would gather in the parish courthouse, which was built like a fortress with thick walls and limited entry points. They would bring provisions for several days and enough armed men to secure the perimeter. They would wait out the deadline together, and once November arrived without another death, the killer's psychological advantage would be broken. It seemed like a reasonable plan, a way to finally regain some control. They didn't realize they were playing exactly into the killer's hands. Because while the knights planned their defense, another plan was unfolding in the freedmen's community. Women gathered in the church, ostensibly for prayer meetings. Men assembled tools and materials, ostensibly for repairs to various buildings. Young people came and went, carrying messages, moving supplies, creating a network of communication that was invisible to white authorities. And in the small house behind the church, Celeste, if that was still the name she used, met with a group of people who had been helping her from the beginning. There was Marie, the hotel serving girl who had overheard the knights' plans and passed them along. There was Charlotte, the woman who had impersonated Celeste on the steamboat. There was Isaiah the deacon, who had misdirected Marshal Holbrook's investigation. And there were others, men and women who had lost family to the knights' violence, who carried their own scars and grief, who had waited years for this moment. They think they're going to fort up in the courthouse, Celeste said. They think they can wait us out. They don't understand that this was never about timing or opportunity. This was always about justice. And justice doesn't stop just because they hide behind walls. She unfolded a map of Bro Bridge, marking locations and routes. The courthouse has one weakness they've forgotten about. When they renovated it in 1867, they added a coal chute for the heating system. It runs from the basement to the street, covered by a grate that can be opened from outside. It's barely wide enough for a person, but it's enough. And once you're inside? Isaiah asked. Then I do what I've been doing all along. I remind them that there are some crimes that law can't touch, some debts that can only be paid in blood. And I make sure that the last four understand before they die exactly why this is happening, exactly whose daughter I am. The meeting continued late into the night, refining details, assigning roles, preparing for what would be the final act of a performance that had been 4 years in the making. Celeste had changed since arriving in Bro Bridge. The polished persona of Madame Dufresne had fallen away, revealing someone harder, colder, shaped by grief and rage into an instrument of vengeance. But she had also changed in ways she hadn't expected, formed bonds with people who had protected her, inspired something in the community that went beyond simple revenge. She had become a symbol, La Veuve Noire, the Black Widow who struck at the heart of the power structure that had oppressed them for generations. Whether she survived what was coming or not, whether she was caught or escaped or died in the attempt, she had already accomplished something profound. She had shown that the knights were not invincible, that justice could find them even when the law couldn't reach them, that there were prices to be paid for cruelty even in a world built to protect the cruel. On October 28th, the 4 surviving knights assembled at the parish courthouse with 8 armed guards. They brought food, water, weapons, and lanterns. They secured every entrance, checking windows and doors, posting men at strategic points. Judge Theriot examined the building's structure, noting the thick walls and limited access. Sheriff Devereaux deployed his deputies in a perimeter around the building. "We're as safe here as we'll ever be," he announced. "Now we wait." Night fell over Bro Bridge, bringing with it the oppressive heat and humidity of a Louisiana October. The courthouse sat on a small hill in the center of town, its windows glowing with lamplight, shadows of armed men visible behind the glass. The town around it seemed unusually quiet, as if the residents had all decided to stay indoors, to wait out whatever was going to happen without bearing witness. In the colored section, people gathered in small groups, talking in low voices, praying and singing hymns that drifted through the still air. They were preparing for something, though white folks who heard the sounds couldn't say exactly what. It felt like the night before a storm, when the air grows thick and the sky takes on a greenish cast, and every animal knows to find shelter. At midnight, Celeste emerged from the house behind the church. She wore dark clothes now, practical garments that allowed free movement, nothing like the elegant dresses of Madame Dufresne. She carried a small bag containing the tools she would need. Her hair was pulled back severely, her face set in an expression of determination that made her look both younger and older than her years. A woman who had lost her childhood to violence and had spent her adulthood preparing to answer it. Isaiah walked with her part way, along with 3 other men who served as lookouts. They moved through back alleys and yards, staying away from main streets, using the routes that colored folks had learned over years of avoiding white attention. When they reached the edge of the town square, Isaiah gripped her arm. "You don't have to do this," he said. "You've already done more than anyone could ask. You've shown them they're not above justice. Let that be enough." Celeste looked at him with eyes that held no mercy, no forgiveness, no doubt. "My mother died begging them for mercy. Did they show her any? Did they consider whether revenge against her was enough? Or did they take everything? Her husband, her home, her life, her daughter's future? This ends when they're all dead, Isaiah, not before." She pulled away and moved into the darkness, toward the courthouse that loomed against the night sky, like a monument to the very injustice she'd spent 4 years trying to correct. The coal chute grate came off with surprising ease, as if someone had loosened the bolts in advance. Celeste slipped through the opening, dropping silently into the courthouse basement. The space was dark, filled with stored furniture and old records, the air thick with dust and coal residue. She waited, letting her eyes adjust, listening for any indication that her entry had been detected. Nothing. The guards were all focused on the main entrances, on the obvious points of access. No one was thinking about a coal chute that had barely been used since the renovation. She moved through the basement with practiced silence, finding the stairs that led to the first floor. This was the dangerous part. The courthouse layout offered few places to hide, and the guards were alert, armed, expecting trouble. But Celeste had advantages they didn't anticipate. She knew, from conversations with Marie and others who cleaned the building, exactly where every squeak in the floorboards was, which hallways offered the deepest shadows, where the guards would be positioned based on standard security protocol. More importantly, she knew that the knights would be together, probably in the main courtroom or Judge Theriot's chambers, staying in a group for mutual protection. They would have guards at the doors, but likely wouldn't expect an attack from inside the building. They thought the threat would come from outside, from a mob of angry freedmen or a direct assault. They weren't prepared for someone already within their fortress. She reached the first floor and paused, hearing voices from down the hallway. Men talking, nervous laughter, the false bravado of people trying to convince themselves they're safe. The sound led her toward the courtroom, where lamplight spilled under the closed doors. Celeste checked her bag, confirming that everything she needed was still there. The knife, sharp enough to cut through leather with a single stroke. The 4 notes, already written, each referencing a specific crime. The small bottle of chloroform and cloth in case she needed to silence someone quietly. And the photograph, creased and faded, that she'd carried for 4 years, the only image she had of her mother, taken by a traveling photographer in 1866, when things had still been hopeful, when freedom had seemed like the beginning of a better world, rather than the opening chapter of a new kind of hell. She looked at the photograph in the dim light filtering through the hallway windows. Her mother smiled at the camera, young and beautiful and full of determination. Sarah Boudreau had believed in justice, in the law, in the idea that the United States government would protect its newly freed citizens. She had testified against her attackers, trusting that the system would work. And the system had killed her for that trust. Celeste folded the photograph carefully and returned it to the bag. Then she approached the courtroom doors, her knife ready, her heart steady, despite the knowledge that what she was about to do would likely result in her own death. She had accepted that possibility years ago. This was never about survival. This was about balance, about making sure that evil didn't go unanswered, about ensuring that her mother's murder had consequences. She reached for the door handle and found it locked from the inside. She'd expected this. She moved to a nearby window, using her knife to quietly work the latch free. The window opened with a faint creak that seemed thunderous in the silent building, but apparently didn't carry to the courtroom. She slipped through, entering a small clerk's office that connected to the main chamber through an interior door. This door was unlocked. She opened it just enough to see inside. The 4 knights sat around the judge's bench, weapons at hand. 3 of the guards positioned near the main doors, while the others presumably patrolled outside. Jessup was drinking from a silver flask. Thibodeau kept wiping sweat from his face despite the cool night air. Judge Theriot reviewed documents as if he could focus on normal business. Sheriff Devereaux stood near the window, looking out at the dark town. "How much longer?" Jessup asked. His voice slurred. 5 hours until dawn," Devereaux replied. "Then we're past the deadline. Then we know she can't keep her schedule. Unless she's already in the building," Thibodeau said, and the others looked at him with irritation born of fear. "I'm serious. What if she got in somehow? What if she's waiting for us to let our guard down?" "The building is secure," Judge Theriot said firmly. "We checked every entrance, every window. There's no way in except through the doors, and they're all guarded. We're safe here. We just need to maintain our discipline until morning." Celeste almost laughed at the irony. They'd checked every entrance except the one they'd forgotten existed, the one that servants and colored laborers used, the one that was beneath their notice. It was the perfect metaphor for their entire worldview. They saw only what they expected to see, only what fit their understanding of how the world worked. The possibility that justice might come from below, through the forgotten channels and invisible people they'd spent their lives ignoring, simply hadn't occurred to them. She waited, patient as death itself, watching their routines, noting when the guards changed positions, when attention flagged, when someone turned their back. She noted that Jessup's drinking was making him careless, that Thibodeau's fear made him jumpy, but also predictable, that the judge's attempt at normalcy meant he was focused on his papers rather than his surroundings, that the sheriff's vigilance was directed outward rather than inward. At 2 in the morning, when exhaustion was beginning to overcome adrenaline, when the guard's attention had settled into routine watchfulness, Celeste made her move. She stepped into the courtroom through the clerk's office door, closing it silently behind her. And in the moment before anyone noticed her presence, she assessed her options with the cold calculation of someone who had planned for exactly this scenario. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said quietly. 4 heads snapped toward her. The guards at the doors turned, raising their weapons. For a moment, everyone simply stared, as if they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. "Madame Dufresne," Sheriff Devereaux said finally. "Or should I call you something else?" "My name," Celeste said, "is Josephine Boudreau. I am the daughter of Sarah and Marcus Boudreau, who you murdered in 1868. I have come to collect the debt you owe my family." She said it calmly, without rage or drama, simply stating a fact. And in that moment, the remaining knights understood that they had profoundly underestimated this woman. She wasn't hysterical or mad. She was purposeful, methodical, completely in control. She had walked into their stronghold, past their guards, into the heart of their defensive position, and she stood before them unarmed and unafraid because she had already won. Whether she killed them tonight or not, whether she escaped or was captured, she had already accomplished what she'd set out to do. She had made them afraid. She had shown them that justice, delayed or denied, would eventually find them. "Guards," Judge Theriot said, "arrest her. Take her into custody." But the guards hesitated. Something about the woman before them, about her absolute certainty and lack of fear, made them reluctant to approach. She looked like she might explode if touched, like she might transform into something more dangerous than she already appeared. "You can try to take me," Josephine said. "You can shoot me, arrest me, drag me to a cell. But before you do, you should know something. I'm not alone. I never have been. Every person in the colored section of this town knows where you are tonight. They know what I'm doing. And if I don't walk out of this courthouse alive, if I don't give the signal that everything went according to plan, they have instructions to burn this building to the ground with all of you inside it. It was a lie, though not a complete one. The freedmen's community did know where she was, and they would certainly riot if she was killed. But Josephine had given no such instructions, had in fact told Isaiah to keep everyone away from the courthouse, to let her face the consequences of her actions alone. But the Knights didn't know that. They only knew that the colored population of Breaux Bridge significantly outnumbered the whites, that racial violence could spread like wildfire, that they were cornered in a building that could easily become a tomb. "What do you want?" Sheriff Devereaux asked. "I want you to understand why you're going to die," Josephine replied. "I want you to know that this isn't random violence or criminal insanity. This is justice, imperfect, delayed outside the law because the law failed us, but justice nonetheless." And then, in a voice that carried no emotion but held absolute conviction, she recounted every crime. Every attack, every murder, every act of terror that these 4 men and their dead companions had committed. She named victims, described incidents, cited dates and locations with the precision of a court document. She had spent 4 years compiling this information, confirming every detail, ensuring that when this moment came, there could be no denial, no evasion, no claim of mistaken identity. The Knights listened with growing horror as she laid out the full extent of their guilt. Individually, each man had known about some of the crimes, but hearing them all together, spoken aloud in chronological order, created a picture of systematic terror that was almost overwhelming in its cruelty. They had done this. They had created this mountain of suffering, of destroyed lives and murdered innocents and shattered families. And they had never faced any consequences, had never even been forced to acknowledge what they'd done. Until now. "You're confessing," Judge Theriot said, desperately trying to regain some sense of control. "Everything you've just said is a confession to multiple murders. We have witnesses." These guards heard every word. Josephine smiled. "Then arrest me, put me on trial. Let me testify in court about everything I've just said. Let me call witnesses from the freedmen's community. Let me introduce evidence about every crime these men committed. Let's have a public trial where all of this comes to light. I'm certain the federal authorities in Baton Rouge would be very interested." The judge fell silent. A public trial would destroy them even if she was convicted. The scandal would be complete and permanent. And there was a real possibility that sympathetic northern newspapers would take up her case, that she would become a cause célèbre, that the trial would expose the entire apparatus of terror that had ruled Louisiana since the end of the war. "What do you want?" Devereaux asked again. "I want what everyone wants," Josephine said. "I want justice. But since the law won't provide it, I'll have to settle for balance. 7 of you are dead. 4 remain. I'll make you an offer, though I don't expect you to accept it. You can turn yourselves in to federal authorities. You can confess your crimes publicly. You can face trial in prison and the destruction of your reputations, or you can refuse and take your chances against me. Those are your only options. And if we arrest you right now," Jessup asked, "if we hang you tonight and claim you attacked us, then you'll have to explain to Marshal Holbrook why you executed a woman without trial, in secret, in the middle of the night. You'll have to face the investigation and the scrutiny and the questions about why she targeted you specifically. You'll have to risk federal troops coming in and imposing martial law. And you'll have to live with the knowledge that the freedmen's community will eventually take their own revenge, one way or another, now or 10 years from now. Is that a risk you want to take?" The standoff stretched on, seconds turning into minutes, tension building until the air itself seemed to vibrate with it. And then, unexpectedly, Judge Theriot laughed, a bitter, exhausted sound. "She's right," he said. "We have no good options. We never did. The moment we started down this path, the moment we decided that law didn't apply to us, we guaranteed this ending. Maybe not this specific ending, but something like it. Justice delayed, she calls it. Maybe she's right. Maybe this is just the bill finally coming due. He stood, moving slowly, as if every year of his age had suddenly caught up with him at once. I won't confess. I won't turn myself in. I don't have that kind of courage. But I won't fight you anymore either. I'm done. If you want to kill me, kill me. If you want to let me live in fear for however long I have left, do that. I don't care anymore. I'm just tired. It wasn't surrender exactly. It was something more like exhaustion, the collapse of will that comes when someone finally acknowledges that they've been beaten. The other 3 knights looked at him with a mixture of contempt and envy. Contempt for his weakness, envy for his honesty. I'm not ready to die, Sheriff Devereaux said, and I'm not ready to give up. He drew his pistol, aiming it at Josephine. You're under arrest for the murders of 7 men. You'll be taken into custody, tried, and hanged. That's how this ends. But before he could take another step, before the situation could escalate into violence, a new sound filled the courthouse. It was singing, dozens of voices raised together, coming from outside the building. The guards at the windows called out in alarm. A crowd had gathered in the square, freedmen and freedwomen from throughout the parish, holding torches and lanterns, singing hymns that had sustained them through slavery and war and the bitter years of Reconstruction. They hadn't come to attack. They had come to bear witness, to ensure that whatever happened in the courthouse tonight would be seen and remembered, to make it clear that Josephine Boudreaux did not stand alone. They had come to reclaim the courthouse that represented law and justice, to surround it with their presence and their voices and their refusal to remain invisible any longer. Sheriff Devereaux lowered his weapon, understanding that the situation had spiraled beyond his control. He couldn't shoot Josephine without triggering a riot. He couldn't arrest her without fighting through a crowd of witnesses. He couldn't make her disappear without ensuring that the story would spread across the entire state, that federal intervention would become inevitable. He was defeated, and he knew it. Dawn broke over Breaux Bridge on October 29th, finding the courthouse still surrounded by freedmen who had maintained their vigil through the night. Inside, the confrontation had resolved itself not through violence, but through a strange negotiation that satisfied no one and yet somehow ended the immediate crisis. Josephine Boudreaux walked out of the courthouse at sunrise, past the guards who made no move to stop her, through the crowd that parted respectfully to let her pass. She had not killed the remaining knights, though she had come prepared to do so. Instead, she had accepted something more valuable than revenge: acknowledgement. Judge Theriot had written out a full confession, documenting every crime committed by the Knights of the White Camellia in St. Martin Parish, signed and dated and witnessed by his fellow knights. The document would never be filed in any court, would never be used as evidence in any official proceeding. But it existed, held by trustees in the freedmen's community, a sword held perpetually over the heads of the men who had created so much suffering. In exchange, Josephine agreed to leave Louisiana and never return. She agreed not to kill the remaining knights unless they resumed their campaign of terror, at which point the agreement would be void. She agreed to disappear, to become a ghost like the mysterious Celeste Dufresne, to let the story become legend rather than documented fact. It wasn't justice, not really. 3 men who deserved to hang would live out their natural lives, unpunished by law, known to their community as monsters, but protected by their wealth and connections. But it was something. It was acknowledgement of guilt, recognition of crime, a permanent reminder that their actions had consequences even when the law looked away. The 4 surviving knights never recovered from that night. Judge Theriot resigned his position and moved to Texas, dying 2 years later from drink and despair. Sheriff Devereaux lost his re-election campaign, defeated by a coalition of freedmen and progressive whites who finally had the courage to vote against him. Harold Jessup sold his hotel and left the state. Marcus Thibodeau continued publishing his newspaper, but never regained his influence. His editorials increasingly bitter and disconnected from the reality around him. The Ku Klux Klan's power in St. Martin Parish broke that autumn. Without its leadership, without the certainty that violence would go unpunished, the organization fragmented and faded. Reconstruction continued, imperfectly and incompletely, but the specific reign of terror that had defined the post-war years finally ended. And Josephine Boudreau, who had spent 4 years as an instrument of vengeance, disappeared into history. Some claimed she went to Mexico, others to Canada, still others to France. The truth was simpler and more practical. She moved to New York, changed her name again, and spent the rest of her life working with organizations that supported freedmen's rights, using her experience and intelligence to help others navigate the treacherous landscape of post-war America. She never spoke publicly about what had happened in Breaux Bridge. She never wrote a memoir or gave interviews or sought recognition for what she'd done. She lived quietly, modestly, until her death in 1903 at the age of 47, and was buried in an unmarked grave in Brooklyn. But in Louisiana, in the colored communities of the Bayou parishes, the story of La Veuve Noire was passed down through generations. It became part of the secret history of Reconstruction, the stories that freedmen told each other about resistance and survival, and the ways that ordinary people fought back against extraordinary oppression. The details changed over time, became embellished or simplified, merged with other stories of vengeance and justice. But the core remained constant. A woman whose family was destroyed by the Klan had taken revenge, had killed the killers, had shown that even the most powerful men were vulnerable to consequences. Historians would later debate whether Josephine Boudreau really existed, whether any of the story was true. Official records of the murders existed, but they attributed the crimes to an unknown assailant, never caught, identity never confirmed. The confession signed by Judge Theriot was never found, though references to it appeared in oral histories collected in the 1930s. Celeste Dufresne left no trace in New Orleans records, suggesting she was either a fabrication or had used such deep cover that her true identity couldn't be recovered. But the absence of documentation doesn't mean absence of truth. In a time when so much violence was carefully erased from official records, when so many crimes went unacknowledged and unpunished, when justice for freedmen existed only in theory, stories like La Veuve Noire served a crucial purpose. They reminded people that resistance was possible, that the powerful were not invincible, that patience and planning and courage could accomplish what law and government could not. And sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, in the places where memory runs deeper than written history, you can still hear an old truth being passed from grandmother to grandchild, from elder to youth. There are debts that law cannot settle. There are crimes that courts cannot punish. There are injustices so profound that they demand answer outside the bounds of civilized society. And when those moments come, when the choice is between accepting oppression or fighting back through whatever means available, ordinary people sometimes find extraordinary courage. 7 men died in the summer and autumn of 1872, their throats cut, their crimes finally answered. 4 survived but never recovered. And somewhere in the shadows of history, a woman named Josephine Boudreau found a measure of peace, knowing that her mother's murder had been avenged, that the men responsible had finally paid a price, that justice, imperfect and bloody and outside the law, had been served. What do you think of this story? Could something like this have really happened in Reconstruction, Louisiana? Do you believe that revenge can ever equal justice? Or does it just perpetuate the cycle of violence? Leave your comment below. I read every single one, and I want to know what you think. If you made it this far, if this story moved you or terrified you or made you think about the hidden costs of history, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who appreciates dark true crime and forgotten